taught school, middle school in Chadron from 73 to 77. And I attended University of Nebraska at Lincoln, received my PhD there, and then went back and began teaching at Chadron State College. I teach composition, and I teach Shakespeare on a regular basis. I also teach humanities at Chadron State and a few survey courses. I have always wanted to write. When I was a kid, I won a little newspaper prize in third, fourth grade that my mother kept in her wallet all her life. Wrote a little piece about some nonsense. But yes, I've always wanted to write, and I usually have found a way to do that. I never began writing with a theme in mind. I began writing with particular words that seem fascinating or unusual to me, and I began working those words into a blank verse line. When something comes of that, I'm more than pleasantly surprised. I'm shocked. But whatever it is, whatever that pattern is that establishes itself, I usually try to maintain it over the course of what is usually considered to be a legitimate poem. Occasionally it works. Heartwood, for example, began with a line of blank verse. It happens to be the first line of the poem. But once I had written that line, I realized that that line necessitated others. That standing by itself, it wouldn't make any sense. And so I continue writing a line after line after line until I had a pretty good pattern established there. But many very, very great poets, like novelists, set out with a preconceived pattern, and I think that's marvelous, if that's one's method. It's never been mine. Well, when I was growing up in South Chicago, I was born in 1945. All the guys went out to work as soon as they could, and for me that was probably about 5 or 6 years old. We would shine shoes there and do this and do that. And when I was about 11 or 12, I saw a crew come by and start trimming trees, and it looked like it was a lot of fun for a kid, you know, to see that. And I started up in 1962 or 3 and found out immediately that it was the most god-awful, agonizing thing I could ever think about. It was terrifying, but the guys I worked with were so mean and nasty, they wouldn't let you quit. And I did run off from the crew on many occasions. I went to work in the steel mill and went to work on the loading docks, but somehow I'd gotten the sawdust in my blood and always kept coming back. So I worked around, and I'm in my 34th year now. I can't work as fast and for as long as I could when I was 20 or 30, but I do a lot better job. I think tree trimming and that profession, you know what you do, you try to find a connection with something else. And I found that that activity was really not much different from the lives that most people live. And I tried to find metaphors from that profession that were universal. I don't believe in the idea of exclusivity. You know, what I do, no one else can have anything to do with. And if you don't walk a mile in my moccasins, you can't understand me. That's the most infantile thing I've ever heard of in my life. That's why we have imagination. We can't go out and and work on a whaling ship. We would read Moby Dick. Yes, and so if the only if my poems that are set in the trees only concern tree trimmers or only concern people who have done that work, then they don't have much value. They do, so I try to, like in Heartwood, there's a family in there. There's human beings, and yes, they work on the trees, but they're not much different from others. That happens to be their profession. So I found the metaphors for that profession seem to cross over pretty well.
For those of you who are new to our collection and our room here, the Heritage Room is a special collection which is dedicated to preserving and promoting works by and about Nebraska authors. And we maintain a collection of over 8,000 volumes, which represents over 2,700 different authors from our state, which is something we should all be very proud of. And in an effort to promote the authors that we have in the state, the Heritage Room, in association with the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association, sponsors the John H. Ames Reading Series to bring authors to a local audience and have that audience come to the authors as well. And I'd like to mention too that the Heritage Room and the services it provides is supported by an endowment fund which was started by the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association in association with the Lincoln City Library Foundation, and which we're very grateful for, because if they wouldn't have done that, we wouldn't be here tonight recognizing everyone. I'd like to welcome and encourage all of you to visit the Heritage Room at some point when we have more time, and we'd be delighted to show you around the collection and some of the treasures that we do have here. But tonight I'd like to introduce Robert McEwen. He is currently a professor of English and Humanities at Chadron State College, and he's also had a long career as a tree trimmer, which is a very interesting thing as well. He primarily writes poetry and fiction, and his love for trees and tree trimming is clearly illustrated in many aspects of that, but he also writes on many other topics too. This is Robert's second reading for the Ames Reading Series, and if I may borrow from Ted Kuzer's introduction from that first reading in 1985, he tells that Robert writes narrative poems, those that come out of the tradition of storytelling that were meant to be listened to, just as were those poems that have lasted the longest. His latest publication, entitled Heartwood and Other Stories, is just such a poem, and he will share some of that with us tonight, along with other selections. So let's welcome Robert.
I'm going to read some poems from Heartwood. In this section, this kid gets his feet frozen off, but they're not completely off. I mean, they're there. They're just, he doesn't know it, that's all. His father, John Price, and a friend of his, a one-armed man named Will Bond, are out on Pine Ridge Reservation, South Dakota, with some other people, and they're cutting firewood to sell at the store up at Wounded Knee. In those days, and even now, many people burned wood to keep warm, and they bring John Price's son with them, and a blizzard comes up, and boy wanders out and gets myrtleized. But some of this is told in flashback. I'm not trying to make the introduction to this longer than what I'm going to read. I just don't want anybody to be confused. You might say if it was well enough written that you're not going to be confused. So what are you going to do? This begins with these guys getting drunk, and I don't like that, but that's what they did. They spent a week in Gordon getting drunk. It's the best thing, Will said. We've got a job requires fornication, by which he meant a cross between a short pint and a fifth of whiskey would provide him with enough determination to complete the job on either side. At week's end, they went north to Calico and rested for 3 days, then on into a fourth, while Patrick stayed behind in Gordon with the weasel bears. They cut along a northern line that ran from Ogallala east to Wounded Knee, and made a crew with Johnny Weasel Bear, the Shangru cousins, Charlie Kills on Top, and Frankie Linehan. Through September on into the later part of fall, they hauled Rickwood to Manderson and stayed the night at Charlie's cabin on the creek. But when the winter hit, they slept outside because the snow made traveling too mean. Well, get him out at Christmas time, Will said. He'll be done with school, and we'll be down at least 12 miles from Chadron on the White River. That's one long haul, John said to Wounded Knee, but look, Will, that'll be the end. You said by February we'd be done, and she can't wait. The she he's talking about is his wife, who's back in Illinois, ready to have their third child, and he's out here on this crazy stunt to cut firewood to haul to the store at Wounded Knee because Will Bond gave his word that they would do that. The big promise is they're all going to move to Southern Illinois, where Ward Bond is the head of the grounds crew at University of Illinois, Southern Illinois at Carbondale, and John Price can go to work. But first they've got to go out here on this crazy scheme to cut the firewood, and his wife's sitting at home ready to have their third kid. And that's why he says, by February, you said by February it would be done, and she can't wait. She's his wife. You know, I never missed a birth, John said, if I could help, but Patrick came too soon, or I'd have been there right on time. I'll bet. I worked a day too late, always an excuse with John Price. You'll make it this time, Will Bond said. You know, you promise anything. These guys will promise anything if it sounds right. To get your own way in the moment, you'll promise anything. It's the delivery that counts. So when Christmas came, they had Pat, his boy, been in school in Gordon, down with Johnny Weasel Bear to help make wood. When he was 29, he told his son, you can't believe the time those wild men had. His wife had heard it all before, but still knew that the telling was for him a truth, and stayed to listen while he passed it on as much to her as to their boy, who sat with eyes as wide as Patrick's must have been when he first saw into his father's life. I still can't figure out why they were there. I know the story is they went for wood, the wood at Wounded Knee. And Will had signed, not with his hand, but with his word, to cut and haul it to the Gildersleeves. Gildersleeves used to run the store at Wounded Knee until 1973, who kept the store and hauled and sold it to the Sioux. That much is clear, but doesn't say enough. They worked as if the western half of hell depended on the ash and elm they cut, or otherwise they'd never get it done. They hit the wood like men who'd gone to war, like tree men climbing close to life and death, embracing both with one soul-jarring howl. My father, your grandfather, rarely worked the ground. He said his back would not obey unless he put some room between the ground and where he stood. The reason he didn't work on the ground is because it's harder to do groundwork than it is to go up into the tree. When you go up into the tree, all you have to do is climb around and make your cuts. You're working down there in the ground, you have to haul all that wood and rake and clean up and hold the ropes. It's a pain in the neck because you have to look up all the time to see what's going on. So John Price makes this big excuse on why I'd rather work in the tree. The reason you'd rather work in the tree is because you didn't have to work as hard. That's why. And he topped out the trees so that they wouldn't get, when they were cut, hung up on the way down. They were all dead, the trees they cut, which meant that he tied into rotten wood. And sometimes when a limb he cut crashed back into the trunk, the whole tree shook as if it wouldn't stand the shock and might break off beneath him where he hung. And Will Bond, the man with one arm, worked with one good arm. His stump was strapped onto a clamp that held his saw. When the wood hit ground, they hauled it out behind a team of horses. Or sometimes the Sioux would work the logs up into piles, then rick it up on wooden skids and send it out. And everybody had a job to do, and no one told another, you do this. they were all afraid of each other, that's why. And why? Because that's not the way to work. When somebody else is carrying an axe or a chainsaw. I see my father in 100 trees crack down the meanest whip in 20 states. But that was when he didn't have a crew that knew the ropes. These men had lived with death so long they finally were free and clear. No one would dream of telling someone else a thing to do or how to live a life. When Patrick told the story later on, he never left out Velma, how she spread his quilts at night and always had a drink of hot milk and molasses when he came in from the woods. She never said a word because she knew that I was mother sick, he said, but fixed the quilt just right and rolled me in and sat beside me with her hand upon my shoulder while she sang into the night, and that old silence I know now meant peace. They'd fixed a large lean-to between two trees and kept a fire in front where Velma cooked and over which she always had a spit with rabbit, squirrel, or venison where you could just walk by and cut yourself a piece. Yes, Velma was the only woman there. She was related to the Shangru boys, but how I never knew. She came to cook and keep the camp and drive the truck and mend and fix and sing her stories late at night. Sometimes I'd wake and hear them by the fire, telling stories of great heroes who were dead. And Will and your grandfather always had a story guaranteed to fire your blood. Imagine what my dreams were like. How could I even know if I had been asleep or if the things I dreamt were happening right there? When Velma and the Slim Buttes crew began to sing, the hair along my neck, my skin began to rise. I couldn't sleep. On the third day after Christmas, Patrick left the camp alone and headed south. The sun was close, the sky was clear. He took a gun, some fry bread, and a hunting knife. A rabbit killer, he said later on. I meant to hear my name around the fire. And he walked far into the meadowland, and long beside the log-strewn river bank before he turned and started back to camp. At 3, a blizzard crashed down from the north. God damn it, Velma, where's our Patrick gone? If you don't know John Price, then no one does. I thought you saw creation from those tops. When dusk came, John was frantic. With the wind, the blizzard breaking in, I've got to find that boy before the blizzard eats him up, he said. They went out then in groups of 3 with ropes around their waists, but couldn't pierce the wind no matter how they screamed. The boy was lost. And they returned with raw, frost-bitten feet. I bumped into a wall, he told Will Bond. It was a haystack, he would tell his son. And so I crawled inside and tried to leave a little space for air to follow through. The only person whom he ever told what it was like to spend 3 days beneath the world was someone who already knew. Velma found him on the morning of the 4th day he'd been gone. She crawled inside and rolled against him, and she asked him how it was. I saw your feet, she said. They told me you were hiding underneath the world today. I found you, Patrick. Now I want to know what it was like. He took the snow she brought into his mouth until he tasted warm salt skin, then tasted wood smoke sweat, the blood within her where he'd been before the start of time, before the start of centuries, before the world began, and tarried long within her boundless warmth on frozen feet. Well, that's a section from Heartwood. I heard that story. My buddy, Uncle Lewis Pretty Boy, ran off from school at Holy Rosary. It must have been in the 40s sometime. And he had that experience. He got lost out in Manderson in the blizzard, and he crawled on a haystack. He said he ate mice. I don't believe that. I mean, when you think about it, I don't. He'll tell you anything. He said he used to tell guys. He used to tell people his nickname is Omaha, and he'd get in the bar and he'd say, "How'd you get your name?" It's a man with no feet. Omaha Beach, he'd say. Call me Omaha. Buy me drinks. My writing has changed quite a bit, like my tree trimming. When I read often, I was a great reader growing up. My mother read to me. My father read to me also. And I thought writing was going to be a very exciting thing to do, just like I thought tree trimming was going to be a very exciting thing to do. I thought all you had to do was get out there and start swinging your saw around and go home with a pocket full of money. But the more the further into the trees I climbed, the more I realized that it required far more discipline than I had at the time to do well. And that happened with my writing too. You read a great poem, and it looks so effortless, and that's one of the marks of a great poem. You say, well, anyone can do that, and of course I said the same thing. And then I tried. I started throwing words down on the page, just like in the trees. I started cutting limbs off the trees, and it didn't work. So I had to really tighten up. I had to stop drinking, I know that, completely. But I had to require the discipline in my tree trimming, and I had to learn discipline with my writing. And even now, I mean, I push myself more and more discipline with that line to get it right, to get it just like the tree, when you come down and you look up, you want to go home feeling good. Well, it's never going to be perfect. If the tree were perfect, you didn't do a good job. If you write a perfect poem, you might as well sell it to Hallmark. So I remember one tree I came down out of Indiana, and this guy said, well, he said, I can see some little sticks of deadwood in that tree that you missed. I said, I didn't miss them. I said, what would that tree look like without a few little sticks of deadwood in it? So the same thing with the line in the poem. It's the discipline. It's the discipline. I know that most people prefer seclusion to write, and I do too, and yet some of my best poems have been written in the midst of out-and-out pandemonium on pieces of scrap paper when I didn't have anything else to write on. And I think once you get your mind focused on the task at hand, that all hell could break loose somewhere else or around you. And I managed to get it down. To me, my life is not interesting to me. I'd rather talk about other people's lives. I mean, so my poems are not based on personal experience. To me, that's the most boring thing in the world. Now, while one writes, everywhere one has lived, everything one has done, you can't keep it out. But to set out to tell people, this is the way I feel, I'd be embarrassed to death. So I write about characters and what is going on with them. A poem about a man named Angus McPhee. Now, I knew a man named Angus McPhee, but I thought he had a neat name, so I wrote a poem about him. And I pronounced it McAfee. I may read that tonight. I'll read old Angus McPhee. I pronounce his name McAfee, and because I pronounce it any way I want. I wrote the name, And Angus, old Angus lived up on the West Branch of the Whitefish River up in the northern peninsula of Michigan. And when I was a little kid, my grandpa, well, anyway, I got out there some way and then wished I was someplace else. This guy would come in from the river, and there'd be these huge clouds of mosquitoes, and he used to smear this stuff on them that you couldn't stand to be around him. He lived on the West Branch of the Whitefish River. And on the West Branch of the Whitefish River, he lived for over 60 years in the same cabin. He had come for pelts and timber at 20 and cleared his 40 acres and put in corn and melons and potatoes to dish up when he felt like it. In the morning, Angus went to the river to fish, and in the evening, too. He fished for trout. He fished over 60 years along the same branch, watching trout swish speckled in the strong current. His career came to be a ritual of threading trout flies, stalking game, and felling pine. Angus McAfee approached death dreading the possibility of a design of which he was ignorant. It might not explain those things: threading trout flies on the West Branch, 100-yard deer shot between the high ribs, timber as it cried crashing to the forest floor, the Chippewa woman who had come to clean and cook and mend his quilts, that daily, nightly ran through everything he thought or did. He could not send his blood away. It all came down to the same wind which swept through his part of the wood. It was the same, if not as life itself, at least as true. He did not wonder where his life had gone, he who was an intimate of nature and of the momentary chaos drawn from the death fit of some tortured animal he had shot or trapped, knew that you did not take a life and screw it away somewhere to cool, or strap it up in the corner of your lean-to for safekeeping, like a string of jerky, to be taken down and eaten if ever you ran out of proper victuals. He did not wonder because he was sure that if there were another place for life to go than where it always kept its place, everything would be dead. The face of the Chippewa woman as she slept under her star quilt, the branch that even in winter slid beneath the spangled ice, and the pines drooping beneath the riven sleet, the beating wind. All were spliced into the guts of everything he did and was. He knew his death would not explain anything. Yet even if its final bid were absolute, his world would still remain. The branch, unless beavers dammed it up, would flow unmolested to the lake, and the wind would carve its passage to the top of Sugarloaf, leaving broken birches in its wake. One evening, Angus read about a burn victim who claimed to have died, whose spirit left his body only to return again within hours. Where is the merit, Angus thought, in fouling up your own death? Might as well work it through. No sense coming back to say you'd regained your breath, and here you are again. A sick bird winging back over the same ground. No, he would stay as long as it took for eternity to catch up with him on Judgment Day, or if even that was not to be, he'd just well up and die and stay dead. But dreading would not do for a man who walked with axe and rod and gun instead of a religious text. One night he drew his knife and held it hard against his chest, a long, thin blade, drop-forged, inlaid. And while the woman watched, he pressed the steel into his breast until it stayed. But she went on with her work, a new star quilt. And Angus, twisting the blade in his chest until the pain jerked him up, cried out that he'd only missed his heart by several inches. Outside, the wind had sent the deer to bed, but Angus held his breath and bled and tried to stop the blood. He wasn't dead. He thought then of the Indian boy up in Nipigon country he'd read about, who carved a man in a canoe, a precious toy that rode the ice floe until it charged into the lakes, and, after fate had played with it a while, made its way into the St. Lawrence, and from there strayed into the sea. From beginning through to the end, it had struggled to be free until, at last, the man in his canoe came home. "My name is Paddle to the Sea," the boy had carved beneath the bow, so that whoever saw it grounded or in trouble would send it on its way. Someone fished it out of the pounding Atlantic surf and sent it back to stay forever with the boy who had sent it forth upon its perilous journey. The more Angus thought about how to the north, the wind blew at least a widow's score colder than it did off Superior. The more he thought about the trip, about what happened, and how it bore upon his dread of death, his dreading slipped away like the current in the West Branch, or like the Chippewa woman would after he was dead, go back to Marquette and make star quilts for her daughter. This is a poem about Bill Winston's last tramp. It was our last tramp through Vandalia. The tall weeds filtering the sun, a train uncoupling, the cars like elephants, dark reddish gray, some lumbering, still lost in Kankakee, or else Peoria along some cinder-littered track. Their groaning now a memory relearned. The others, just as much belabored, but with groanings less a memory than something fixed, a weld perhaps, or many weldings, great with rust. I saw them from the corner of my eye. The late part of the day, Bill Winston fell beneath one while we ran to snag our freight. It was our last tramp through Vandalia. A sonnet. Sophocles, the Theban plays. You know, I've been watching that Theban play for a long time, and I've never seen him do a damn thing worth remembering. The Theban plays. I don't think they were written to deprive us of our joys or send us scurrying for cover like uncovered crabs. Our lives are desolate enough. Our beaches ring the scavenger's delight with pickings slim or copious, depending on the glib, unbiased thrashing of the waves. Give him at least his due for our desire. He did not fashion like a carpenter the pitch or square the bleak dimensions of this stage. The seabirds and the land birds too enrich their nestlings with disgorgings of our rage, and mash the marrow of our parents' bones into an edible concoction with our own. Oh my. Then there were two. Was it the way she died the matter, or the fact? Would you have had her breath preserved, ordained for your delight? I ask you this because I loved her too. My guts, along with yours, unraveled more with every day she died. The sight of her disintegrating like a lump of hardened sugar in a cup of scalded tea became, for me, like you, a grainy paste my eyelids couldn't scour. I might have loved her more because I wished her dead. Your passion for prolonging death, disgorged, became for her a shameful life. But maybe that's not fair. I know you'd choose your death before her own. I know you prayed her suffering were yours. But don't you see life's balances are tipped towards mutual extinction of the ones we love and us? Come, friend, come, brother, come what may, from this we'll never go our separate ways. Poem from western Nebraska. Coyotes Cry, Dawes County, Nebraska, 1996. Sharp against the sandstone bluff, I heard a coyote's cry. No wind could sound as desolate that morning, with the sky's unwillingness to show the sun, and fog like shoulders bowed and gray and settled in a shroud upon the boulders of the bluff. They set out bait, the ranchers hereabouts, strychnine, I think, and things go hard for coyotes and stray dogs, not practiced in efficiency of modern management. It's not malicious, mind. If you kept lambing ewes or sent cows off to market every year, depended on each birth to hold your place, you'd do it too. You'd measure your own worth against a howling at the bluff unheard beneath the fog, against the nasty dying of a wild, untutored dog. I'm sure we're all influenced by where we live and the people we know. The degree to which I have been influenced by living in Nebraska is unknown to me, since very few of my poems deal self-consciously with this geographical area. I really don't know to what extent Nebraska has influenced my poetry. I don't consider my writing to be a mission to enlighten other people. When I get down out of a tree, I want that tree to blend in such a way to the environment around it that it enhances the house, the landscape, everything around, and the people who live in the house. When the only thing you got there is the tree, then it sticks out like a sore thumb no matter how well it's trimmed, and it makes everything look silly. So the same way with the poem. I want to write a competently written poem for people who do you want to work for? Who do you want to get a compliment from? If you're a mechanic, you want to get a compliment from other mechanics. Why? Because they know the trade. If you're a poet, you want to get, you are writing for people who appreciate poetry. Why? Because their criticism carries some weight. You're trimming the tree, you want the tree trimmers to come around and look at it and critique it. The person living in the house, they don't know what a tree's supposed to look like. They can say swell job and it's a mess. But I can't imagine a poet who doesn't feel a certain amount of gratification when other people say, I really enjoyed reading this, even if it is a mess. I have some poems that are set in Ireland. I've been writing some stream of consciousness blank verse poems set in Ireland with Irish speakers that the poems are set, maybe 50, 60 years ago. The voice is different. And I have a nice poem that I have written for my youngest daughter, Shavana. I'm going to read that. I don't know. I was sitting down in the basement and remembered an incident that happened to us quite some time ago, and I wrote a line, and it led to another one. It's a poem for my youngest daughter, Shavana. Do you remember our first trip about 8 years ago? Do you remember at the start before us lay a road not desolate but flat and bare of any other cars until at 35 miles out we saw a bus not far, maybe a quarter mile ahead. It was a school bus, bright, unspotted yellow, with a wide back window door, unlit yet clear. At 5 a.m. an August morning, what occasion to have driven out this far. Yet nothing but the muted window answered us. Then all at once we saw, as we drove several car lengths on, a sight in that dim dawn that set my foot, though lightly, on the brake. Do you recall? For you were but a month away from school, and not so tall to be without your fears of that first day. And anything reminding you of that first day would usually bring a blankness to your eye. And now, upon this open stretch bordered by fields, by stands of elm, storm-sheared, some over in the ditch, we found within a car's length clowns cavorting in a bus, who bounced and veered and pulled their ears, then tipped their hats to us. They were either children not too far ahead of you in years and height, or midgets decked as clowns with flopping shoes and multicolored coats and hair like iridescent hay and faces merry, washed in paint. It's clowns, you shouted. Wait! We kept a car length for a mile or so until they flashed a turning light, then slowed and turned where I had never guessed there was a road, away. We drove almost till evening, and through the day, at intervals, our eyes would meet like wings coming together, or two palms met merrily in play. Those clowns, we'd laugh. Who were those clowns? Our wonderment that day remained our theme so many miles beyond our journey's end. You started school that fall, far ready more to fend alone the matter of your size than you had been before we saw those clowns, their brimming eyes, their mischief at the door. The poem I'm writing now has a character in it named Elmer Basswood. Elmer Basswood is 96 at the time this poem is being written, and had a little trouble with his memory. He married many years before John Ghost's daughter. John Ghost was a blacksmith and a gunsmith. This poem is for Elmer Basswood, getting on near 93. It comes as easily and at the end of day as I predict it surely will along about the ending of your life. The frantic sense that John Ghost's daughter never lived did not for 50 years engrave the floating limits of your life. So, how can she be gone who never yet was here? You'll ask yourself, how many times an hour, until at dusk one summer's day, or else in winter when the sun departs so suddenly you can't imagine light, you understand the answer's question is a curse. The only narrative that never ends turns out to be the only story you did not begin in time. The humpbacked bluff you now remember as the place may prove, despite the glory of your morning there, to be the night before, when you first saw her sweating at her father's side, her apron in the deep metallic shade of that close room, an oil-illumined spread of pre-dawn sky. Was there a lantern lit the shop, or did the sun next morning like a lantern rise? Or wasn't it her eyes alone, destroyed set time, dispensing light as deftly as she'd file a hammer, carve an oaken stock? And how long after did you learn her apron was the tent flap to the sky? When John Ghost died, she came to live with you. Remember that your grandson's eyes are set the spit of his. Old man, you've lived back in these hills too long. It isn't John Ghost's daughter buried at the summit of that bluff. Unroll yourself or be prepared to die. Our memories are rusty spinnings of the undissolved, recast, clairvoyant in the scalding now. Well, we got a few more here. Which one do you want? This poem is for Agnes Mattie Conlon, 1892 to 1953, on the occasion of her funeral. The speaker is her son. He mentions the word N-I-N-A, Nina or Nina, not too long ago, but anyway, a while back, when the Irish came over in hordes. There were signs, shops in the East Coast. Nina, no Irish need apply. He mentions that. It also mentions Madre de Dolores, Mother of Sorrows, and there are a few other allusions, but you know, what the heck. Here we go. On the occasion of her funeral, it couldn't have been worse today. The sun in everybody's eyes, the robins with their young, the strain of Mexican guitars that cried from several blocks away, their songs discordant with our grief. She was an Irish woman practiced long in the necessary war. Not war, my friend, with kelp and coast. That would have been my mother's ma, who stayed behind while half the rest, with half their half-starved wits, sailed for America, where now all drink green beer. It wasn't Nina then, by God. Your Patty went on strike and then applied. We cut against the spongy guts until they bled. And wasn't it herself alone collected money for the lads while I stayed by myself at home? I hope in death her rages pass. It never was her war, her land. I wouldn't know whose words were trash, whose blood first stained whose bloody hands, unless I'd had it at her breast. We should have had a sky today uncomforting, a rain hard blessed in bleared redemptive, pelting waves of unction for such suffering. The damp condolence of a God dispensing round the martyr's wings to children of that prickly sod. The Mexicans were out of tune and drowned our painful pipes with mirth. I prayed for there to sound at noon a dirge as painful as the birth of hatred and revenge. Why fight a holy war to save lost bones? I wasn't of that soil. What right had she to violate our home with lunatic, unsettled scores, with Father Murphy's rambling hearse until you'd have to bolt the doors against the splendor of her curse? The Mexicans have skulls to eat. They are confectioners of death, whose Madre de Dolores weeps in sugar water tears. Our health is measured by our contact with the stiffs who weren't allowed to die. She'd cram them in at table with the coldest at the head, and why? She'd level at the greenest there, her frothy chin and fevered eyes thrust at the nearest vacant chair. And why, my darling, did you die? She should have taken me those nights she made her rounds. I would have spit, I'm telling you, at all their fights. It wasn't me she loved, but Brits, blown high into an Irish cloud, where they in death could be reblown. The Mexican guitars were loud today. The sun refused to mourn. I have had wonderful teachers in my life. Now you talk about inspiration. People inspire me. Great teachers in my tree trimming, Jim D. Manning, who I worked with for years, was one of the greatest teachers I've ever had. Dorset Graves out in Chadron, Nebraska, was an early teacher of mine and continues to be invaluable help with my writing. People at the university were so encouraging to me. Mordecai Marcus and Hilda Raz. Gee, I'm going to leave somebody out. But so many people have helped me. I still don't consider writing to be a solitary effort. Whenever I write a poem, it's a group effort. You know, John Dewey said it best, along with 20 million other people: if you want to do something, do it. Read and write. You don't have to go out and make a fool out of yourself. There is no prescription for any particular kind of life one must live if he or she wants to be an artist. One must study his or her art, and one must engage in it to the point where at times there are degrees of obsession, and certainly if one wants to become more proficient at one's trade, whether it's trimming a tree or writing a poem, you've got to devote yourself to that end. But what you do in your personal life, if you go out and engage in self-destructive activity, your career is not going to be long. And the greatest poets who were also drunks, Dylan Thomas comes first to mind, was the first to say he never wrote a line, was able to write a line under the influence of alcohol. So the way one conducts oneself, one's personal life, I think is very important. But the reading and the writing of poetry is the most important thing for young people who want to do that. And to find and to seek out good teachers. when I went into the trees, went after the best tree men. Learn from those guys. Do what they tell you. Well, I'm working on a long poem that contains a blank verse, dramatic sections, and prose. And it's called, I've changed the title 3 times, so this is 10. It's about a woman who lives up in Pine Ridge, South Dakota at a place called Mission Ridge, which doesn't exist. Her name is Silky Sullivan. And she wakes up on a morning in late December in 1996, which is going to, I figure that's when I'm going to finish it. So, and during the course of the next 24 hours, she has quite a bit of fun reminiscing on her first 50 years of life. There's a long genealogy connected with it, and it started out as Silky's Day, then it went to Silky's Song, and now I think the Silky Chronicles would be nice. I've been writing poems about Silky Sullivan for about 15 years, and I finally decided to make something of them. Nora Cormack's Near, as in Nora Cormack is near. It wasn't just the mushrooms she bewitched, but so it was the crusty hearts of us that for so many generations had grown lame and unresponsive to the light. On any winter's day, you'd find her fleet upon the road, with head uncovered, feet like leaping hares, each eye a roving joy. And if she caught your sleeve, she'd have your wits, no matter weight of misery you bore. And afterwards, maybe a league, maybe for several days gone by, you'd swear you'd been transported west on horseback through the sky. Some told that she was just beyond threescore, but if you strayed within the compass of her eyes, you'd vow she'd leapt 100 years and started up again. And where she came from, no one ever learned. But only weeks of Nora's biding here had everyone believing she was native born, although my grandfather, notorious for doubt, swore Nora'd been for centuries a dream on temporary loan from Skibbereen. It was at hasty weddings, wakes, and births she worked her major feats, though not a day unraveled, but she'd woven kindness there. The way when darkness fell remained a spell that smothered bitterness in coils of sleep. And when an infant died, her keen would swell the air like lusty seraphim. And when a man went overboard, she'd mend his nets. It's long years now she's gone from this, in shape more easily identified as hers. My grandfather, just so, soon followed her, himself a lovely dream. But kindness bides when all is said, in short, convulsive leaps through blinding light. Our grandchildren will know where Nora Cormack spread her flaxen hands upon a sharp, grief-darkened brow and coaxed it clear. They'll know her leaning cabin with its silly head of ragged thatch stood hard against that yonder stone-infested hill, and maybe see her too upon the road and fall within the compass of her eyes. That comes next. I'd like to thank you all for coming. I appreciate your attention and your concentration, and really happy to be able to read for you.